Join former FBI senior forensic examiners Becky Passmore and Stacey Eldridge as they dig into the world of digital forensics, one bite at a time. Now leading their own consulting firms and educating the next generation of cyber sleuths, these badass babes of digital forensics bring sharp insight, real-world case experience, and a dose of humor to the bits and bytes that build today's investigations. From deep dives into business email compromise and ransomware attacks, Becky's specialty, to cracking the complexities of iPhone forensics, Stacey's obsession, this podcast delivers insider knowledge for professionals, students, and true crime techies alike. If you've ever wondered what really happens when the digital trail is all that's left, tune in and start parsing the truth.
Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time, is proud to welcome our first sponsor, Ace Forensics. They are based near Chicago, and they've been building systems since 1983. Ace Forensics delivers high-performance digital forensics workstations, laptops, and servers to justice agencies across the United States and around the world. They offer unmatched value and the industry's only 5-year digital forensics warranty. Ace Forensics build the systems your digital forensics software deserves. If you're procuring digital forensics equipment, reach out to them for a competitive quote. Now, on to our episode. Welcome back to Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time. I am Stacey Eldridge, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Becky Passmore. If this is your first episode, you should know we are the podcast that focuses on digital forensics in today's modern crimes. So yes, we're talking about true crimes, but our focus is the facts and the artifacts that the digital forensic examiners are finding, or sometimes not finding, in digital evidence. Becky, what are we doing tonight?
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're continuing our coverage of the first Karen Read trial. And we're getting into the testimony of the prosecution's second digital forensics expert, Ian Whiffin. And I have to say, Stacey, when I was going through my notes on this, I kept having to slow down and reread things because the technical detail here is dense. But it matters. All of it matters. Every single piece of it matters to understanding what the data actually shows versus how it was initially characterized.
I totally agree, Becky. And I think that's one of the things that makes this testimony so important to go through carefully. And if you think about it, you and I have listened to the testimony more than a handful of times for each person. We've referred to our notes about 1 million times. So just imagine how the jury is feeling as they're hearing all of this stuff. I mean, we're kind of coming at it from two different angles, right? Because they're looking at it from, if Karen Read did or did not do what she's accused of. And we're looking at it from more of an educational perspective. And we've got to make sure that we understand all these artifacts. But the point being is if the jury doesn't understand something, then they tend to not take it into regards, right?
Right.
And so, I think people hear phrases, whether it's on the news or in the courtroom, they say stuff like Cellebrite said. And the Cellebrite, in this case, it said the Cellebrite report identified a search at 2:27 a.m. Sounds very clean. Sounds very definite, right? It's a sure thing. But what Ian Whiffin ends up doing over the course of his testimony is he essentially pulls back all the artifacts and things that make this up. He goes layer by layer, and he shows the jury that there's a lot more going on. It's just not this one artifact that tells the whole story. The data doesn't lie, but the interpretation can be confusing and misleading. So it's easy to understand why people have strong feelings about this case, this evidence, these artifacts, and these findings. So that's why we're walking through it very carefully.
And we have to listen to and hear what's being said and articulate that for our listeners. So let's get into it.
All right. So the prosecution's second digital forensic expert witness is Ian Whiffin. He is the decoding product manager at Cellebrite. Now, you should know that before he started his employment with Cellebrite, he was a law enforcement officer in both the United Kingdom and Canada. He states in his current role, he uses his knowledge of digital forensics and the digital forensics community to assist developers with creating and maintaining a program that the examiners would want to actually use.
Right. He also developed his own forensics tool called ArtEx, which he has worked on for around 5 years. He built it because, as an examiner, he kept running into applications he needed to parse that the main vendors didn't support. He has given it away free to the digital forensics community, and it now has approximately 500 users globally. It is taught as part of SAN's digital forensics training course. He maintains a personal website where he shares that research and those tools with the community, and he has published articles related to the artifacts found on mobile devices.
Yeah, and I can't remember which one it was, if it was the Magnet Forensics Virtual Summit or the Masabi one, but in one of those, somebody during their presentation specifically mentioned ArtEx. So, people definitely use it. 500 sounds small, but digital forensics isn't, like millions of people doing it at that level across the globe. And I will say, I personally tried to use it in a case about, it's coming up close on 2 years ago, because the other side had mentioned that they had used it. So I was like, okay, well, let's see what it's all about. And I was like, I didn't see a need for me to use it at that time. But fast forward to a couple months ago, I did use it in a case. So it definitely has its niche uses for sure. It's a solid tool. He's got a really nice README file that totally gets you up and going and up to speed right away. So if you're looking for a tool that does something that your other tools don't do and it's free, you might want to check it out for yourself and see if you can use it.
Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, let's get back to the testimony. So Cellebrite also operates a global email address called Stumpers, and it's open to any user. And the idea behind it is that if an examiner comes across an artifact they can't explain, they can email this email address. And then Ian Whiffin and his colleagues, they'll research and reply to the why. So you can get some information about artifacts that way. Now, he was also asked as he was getting on the stand, about his prior court experience. He said he has testified about 20 times, mostly in Canada, but also once in Michigan and once in Australia. And one more time in the UK, the United Kingdom. So here's a fun fact. If you remember our guest at the end of the Mushroom Murder series, Dr. Sorrell, he had told me a while ago that he had actually testified in a trial with Mr. Whiffin. They were both there. I'm not sure who was on what side, but that's so funny that we had Dr. Sorrell on the show and he testified in the same trial that Ian did. So it does show what a small community we are, right?
Agreed. Now let's talk about how Whiffin got involved in this case. In September 2023, he was initially contacted by a Cellebrite colleague who had been asked about a confusing timestamp found on a device. He asked the colleague to connect him with the investigators and share any information that they could. He was then advised that the full extraction of the device had already been uploaded to Cellebrite's support network. So he was able to access it directly and begin his analysis. An extraction, he explained, is all of the files and folders extracted from the same device, saved in a zip file container in a way that is as close to the original form from the device as possible.
Question he was asked to answer was to explain the 2:27 a.m. timestamp that was associated with a web history artifact. So very similar question was posed to him that was posed to Jessica Hyde that we talked about her testimony in the past 2 episodes. And again, the investigators found this timestamp. It simply didn't make sense to them. And Whiffin is explaining this. And then he also noted that several weeks later, around December timeframe, he was contacted by a police investigator in Austria with a very similar question about a different internet search. And then about a week after that, the defense expert in that same Austrian case also contacted him and asked the same question. Now, in that case, the defense expert was able to provide him with the database, and then Whiffin was able to provide the answer. Commentary here, it's definitely not a one-off situation where examiners had questions about artifacts and they contact Cellebrite. And In this case, it seems to be the same artifact, and multiple people are emailing Cellebrite about it. So they took the expected steps here, right? They were trying to figure out what the heck was going on with the timestamp. And one valid research avenue is to certainly call the tool vendor that processed it out and ask them, like, how are you populating that artifact? How are you parsing it out? What is that coming from? And they can certainly validate if they are parsing it out as expected. They might be able to tell you more behind it. They might not. They might just say, yes, it's parsing as expected. And then you might have to go and figure out the significance of that artifact and what it actually means. But good first step to contact Cellebrite, right?
That's right. That's right. So Whiffin starts by walking the jury through the Safari history database, history.db. And once the exhibit is admitted, it's displayed on the screen for everyone in the courtroom to see. It contains a selection of records of the history.db. He points out records highlighted in green are from 2:27 a.m. and they are all connected to a website called Hockomock Sports. There are 4 of them in total, all just seconds apart from each other. And he also notes that there are earlier visits going back to 12:42 a.m. also for Hockomock Sports. So this is a site that had been visited multiple times over the course of several hours that night.
And before he gets into the substance of what those records means, he takes some time to do some foundational explaining. He explains what the SQLite database actually is and how it works. He explains that every record in the database is assigned a unique ID number and that the number is never reused. So here's us explaining it. For example, if you're going through this database and you see that these ID numbers jump, say you have 412, 413, and then it jumps to 415, that gap tells you that record 414 existed at some point and now it's gone. So it's been deleted from the database. Why is it gone? That's some work you'll have to do as a forensic examiner to see if you can determine that. But essentially, this is a nice paper trail that's built into the database itself. And so he said when he looked at the records in the history.db between early January and February 2nd, so before and after the night in question, he found no gaps at all. He said all of the unique ID numbers were completely contiguous. And so that means from his analysis, no records had been deleted from that history.db during that time period.
That's going to become a really important point later, so it's worth keeping in mind. Then they turn to a searched items record parse from the browserstate.db, and this specific record from 2:27 a.m. is entered into evidence as Exhibit 615. Again, we'll put the link to the exhibits in the show here in the show notes. Whiffin explains that this record shown is what's called a derivative item. It's not a primary record of a website. It's constructed from web history records and used to identify searches that were conducted. Cellebrite extracts the search query and presents it in a readable form. In this case, the value logged in that record was house long to die in cold. Also, remember from Jessica Hyde's testimony that the browserstate.db is responsible for tracking the Safari tabs.
I learned something here from his testimony. Well, I learned lots of things from everybody's testimony, but I'm not a big Cellebrite user. And so he said that the searched items was a derivative item. I thought that was very interesting. So there's not something, a database that says, here's all the searched items, but they are looking for search queries and putting it out here. So again, that's something interesting and good to know about how your tool works. Next up, a few different artifacts are discussed. First, he describes the KnowledgeC.db as a system database that logs a large amount of information about the device. He explains that it records things like the backlight turning on and off, when the device is locked and unlocked, when an application is in focus, and of course, what that application is, and the length of the time in focus. And he explained that in focus simply means that that's the primary item visible to the user. So If you're using a phone, you're probably familiar with having multiple apps running all at the same time. But generally, you're going to look at one and it's going to be on the top, and then everything else is behind it in the background. And so, in Apple terminology and in the logs, the one you are actively using is considered the one that is in focus. So, something to think about here is if you can see or determine what app is in the foreground, then you might be able to determine what web page was in focus as well.
Interesting. Then it's back to the browserstate.db. He states it's just a name that Apple gave to it. And he's careful to explain that the browserstate.db has a history. It's changed quite a bit over different versions of iOS and iOS 14, stored the state of open browser tabs, but then starting with iOS 15, the behavior changed significantly. Records are now only written to browser state when a tab is closed. So it doesn't give you a window into what's currently open. It's a log of what was previously closed. And again, this goes back to why it's important to understand which iOS version you're analyzing.
Yep. And that distinction that in this version it logs closed tabs, not open tabs, is at the heart of why this 2:27 a.m. timestamp has been so contested. I think, based on how it was in iOS 14 and then just the name of some of the columns and stuff in here, people assumed that that timestamp represented when the search was conducted. And again, as he's testifying here, he mentions that he developed ArtEx and that he uses it for his own research purposes. And he also mentioned that it does have some capabilities that aren't available in other commercial forensic tools. And so that's why he's able to see certain things in the data that a standard analyst might miss.
Okay. Then he's asked directly, why does the browser state record from 2:27 a.m. appear as deleted? And he says simply, because it is deleted. He explains that there are two ways a user can delete browsing data. Either they wipe everything off on the device, or they delete selectively, which could mean deleting individual items or choosing a time window like the last hour or the last 2 days. They start to ask him why he doesn't believe the user was responsible for the deletion. But there's an objection and a sidebar, and that line of questioning gets dropped.
Next, we move on to the mobile Safari .plist. We talked about this in the last two episodes, so it's a .com.apple.mobile.safari.plist. And anyways, if you don't have that memorized yet, you will soon, but we're going to just kind of say it short with the mobile Safari plist to keep it easy here. Anyways, this is another piece of foundational information that the jury needs to understand. Background information, refresher information for some of you. A plist is short for property list. And this is how Apple stores serialized data. Whiffin mentioned that specifically that it stores a serialized data. Our commentary is you can think of it as a structured list with names paired with values. Whiffin continues on. It is primarily used to store your preferences. Some examples of that would be like, do you want light mode, dark mode, how often your tabs would auto clear. And he also explained, here's the interesting thing, that recent search history and the search method will be saved in it. And here's a key detail that he went over that you need to keep in mind. For a search to be logged in this plist file, it has to be typed into the built-in Safari search bar. You're saying, well, what is the built-in Safari search bar? So on your iPhone, that's the one that appears just above your keyboard on the iPhone. So if you would go to google.com and type in whatever your search is into Google search bar window there within the browser, like in the middle of the page, that will not get logged into this plist. The plist is only going to capture what is in Safari's native little search bar there right above your keyboard. And let's see, this exhibit number, he shows it in exhibit number. I didn't catch it, but all of his exhibits go in order. So you can, once you get to the his exhibits, you can go through in order and see them all. There didn't seem to be any missing from what we linked to. But in this exhibit of the P list, he's showing 3 search terms and they're in reverse order. So the newest going down to the bottom. I call that reverse. I always put the oldest on top. I don't know what everybody else does, but that's my mind. Old is on top, just like us, right, Becky? We're
That's
on top.
right.
But anyways, so it does show in here these 2 important search terms. And this is the point of his exhibit, I believe. It shows that how long to die in cold and how long to die in cikd are both in there. And their search term timestamps in UTC, and then it has it local, but it matches what we've been talking about with the how long to die in cold at 6:24, and the how long to die in cikd is at 6:23 a.m.
Glad you say those terms. He also addresses private browsing directly. In private browsing mode, Safari doesn't save searches. It doesn't save navigation history. Nothing gets logged. So if someone had conducted these searches in a private browsing session, these records simply wouldn't exist. He's asked whether, in his opinion, these searches were not conducted in private browsing mode, and he says yes. The existence of the records is itself proof that private browsing was not active.
Yeah, and I thought the way the lawyer phrased that question was kind of odd because he says yes, but you would think like the answer you want is no. So again, you have to listen carefully and answer carefully when you're answering these questions. But hopefully he knew that this was coming. And of course, if you don't understand, ask. So he goes on to explain something else called failure to load. And you should take note because this is also going to become central to understanding why a couple of these searches don't appear in the history.db. And they'll talk about that later on. So a bit of a preview. Now, we're giving you that tip. The jury didn't get that tip. They can't preview their testimony. But anyways, Whiffin explains that when you navigate to a web page, data streams from the web to the device, and then it renders on your screen. And then at the completion of that load event, a function runs and then records that visit to history.db. But if the page doesn't load, if it doesn't finish loading, if you lose your internet connection, something like that, if you close the tab before it finishes, or if you get an explicit failure to load message, the function will never run and nothing will get written to the history.db. He does specifically note that he has seen some failure to load events logged in the browserstate.db before, but they don't always show up there either. But the point of all of this is to take away that a search can be conducted, a page can be requested, and if it never loads, the history.db won't show that it ever happened. Yeah. It's not going to be in there.
He's asked whether the plist saves all sorts of history. He says no. Primarily used to save preferences such as light mode or dark mode, or settings like when you want your tabs to auto clear. It does have several days of search history, though he doesn't know exactly how many days worth. He explains that for a search to be saved there, it must be typed into the Safari search bar that appears just above the keyboard on the iPhone. Typing into the Google search bar with the browser will not be logged there.
So it's some good repetition going on there. I think it's good for the jury to hear some of this stuff a couple of times to, get them to think, and then maybe they'll be like, oh, we should go back and reference some of this testimony. But anyways, next he is asked what he observed about the 2 searches at 6:23 and 6:24 a.m. And he answers that they were conducted using the built-in Safari search bar, but they don't appear anywhere in the history.db. And since there are no deleted records in the history.db, I think I would say there's no records missing from the history.db would be the better way to say that. Anyways, he concludes that those pages never successfully loaded.
So next he's then shown a comparison document, a table that lines up search terms from the mobile Safari plist against corresponding entries in history.db. For the vast majority of searches, there's a matching entry in history.db within about a second. But the 2 searches from 6:23 and 6:23 a.m. and 6:24 a.m., how long to D in D and House Long to Die in the Cold, those do not have any corresponding entry in history.db. So you need to remember this isn't all of the internet history. This is only the Google search terms matched up with search terms in the plist. So far, for it to be present in the exhibit, the Google search term has to be in both the plist and the history.db. You see a search in both for Raining Maine on 127 at 4:49 p.m.
No, it's supposed to be Raining Men. Sorry.
You see a search in both for Raining Men on 127 at 4:49 p.m. We're assuming local time based on other exhibits. We see Antoinette Oko and basketball on 128 at 11:38 p.m. Nothing from the 29th. Then BPD and John O'Keefe at 8:06 a.m. Then BPD and John O'Keefe at 1:30 at 8:06 a.m.
And he's next asked about what he concludes from all of that. His answer is that both searches were entered using the built-in Safari search bar. The plist confirms that, but neither page ever successfully loaded. Otherwise, there would be a record. The absence of any matching entry in history.db combined with the confirmed absence of any deleted records from the history.db leads him to conclude that these pages simply never finished loading. He reiterated again that the two searches from 6:23 and 6:24 a.m., the How Long TD and Kikdi and House Long to Die in Cold.
He explains how browserstate.db works again, reiterating that in iOS 15, it is only written to when a tab is closed. In private browsing mode, records are never written to it at all. So what it gives you is a list of previously closed tabs, not a view of what is currently open. He's then asked what the last viewed time field means. Based on his research, it relates to one of 4 events. When the user creates a brand new tab, when they switch tabs and bring one back into focus, when they close a tab which automatically brings a backgrounded tab into focus, or when Safari has been completely closed and then reopened.
Now, you might be asking yourself, like we've been asking ourselves, but what about the open tabs? Where do they go? Don't they matter anymore? So they went to Safari tabs.db. And I believe that also occurred in iOS 15. I definitely know it's present in iOS 16. And logically, it would make sense for that change to have occurred in iOS 15, right? Because where did the open tabs go? Sometimes Apple doesn't make sense. So make sure to test this out for yourself if you're having to deal with this in your next case. Now, back to the testimony. Whiffin was next asked to explain how an earlier timestamp could be associated with a subsequent search. So he explains that if he creates a 12 o'clock tab, minimizes Safari, he could leave it for several hours, days, weeks, and that this time difference of how long he's leaving it alone doesn't really matter. But when you finally come back to it and open it up again, open Safari again from the background, the timestamp is not going to be updated. So it's still going to show 12 p.m. today of when it was open. And it's going to show whatever the most recent navigational event is. So he's saying he could open something 3 weeks later using the same tab that was open today, and the timestamp is still going to show today's date and time. Is that crystal clear or clear as mud? I don't know. But the takeaway here is basically the timestamp does not have anything to do with the value, that URL that is present. You have to keep remembering that this timestamp is about the tab, not the browsing itself.
Next, he's shown the entire Google URL entry for the browserstate.db search. It's Exhibit 618. He explains the columns. So again, I'm going to read from the above screenshot, which is also going to be linked in your show notes. When asked how this relates to earlier testimony, he says, this confirms the Safari search bar was used and matches the records shown in the Safari plist shown earlier.
Next up is Exhibit 619. These are the live records in the browserstate.db. Now, you might be wondering, what do you mean by live? These are all the records that are actually sitting in the browserstate.db file. Think of it as a file for a second. This data is not coming from the WAL file. Take note that there's only some records displayed. There is 4021 through 4025, and then 4031 and 4032. So you can see there are some records missing. The search for house long to die in cold is not shown. And the timestamp on the far right is under the field name last viewed timestamp, and it's shown in local time. There's just a variety of different searches showed in here. Some related to Canton High School, logging into your PayPal account, a different bank account. So miscellaneous stuff is shown in that exhibit.
Yep. And so then next up is Exhibit 620. And this is the entries from the WAL file for browserstate.db. He's asked what he sees in the exhibit, and he notes that some numbers are repeated and explains that because there are different versions of the same record. There are 3 records where the only difference between them is the tab order. He also points out that there is no page title on any of them, which is due to the page never having completely loaded. He then confirms there are no private browsing indicators logged here, noting that private browsing activity isn't even recorded in browser state anymore. That means these searches were not conducted in private browsing mode. He also explains that what a session is and how it applies in this context. A session is essentially the life of a particular tab, and all the activity within that tab is considered part of the same browsing session.
Let's go ahead and wrap up the episode here. It's a good stopping point. We're probably a little more than halfway through his testimony, but I think it's a good stopping point. We could take a minute, discuss anything that we've heard so far. Becky, do you have any comments or anything you'd like to rehash?
I just think Ian Whiffin does a great job in explaining the differences. There's a lot of databases, there's a lot of stored information, and then there's different versions of the iOSs that he's able to articulate where and what falls within each one of these categories. And so I think he does a really good job in breaking that down and making it clear. And like you said, have some repeatable comments and testimony for his testimony, and to make it be able to be understood by the jurors.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of the exhibits that were created are helping to put these things together, like, it shows which search terms were both in the plist and the history.db. And then he's working to explain, well, why they're talking about failure to load, and that's impact, and why if there's a failure to load, it doesn't show up in the history.db. I think the things I want to hear as a forensic examiner is a little bit different than what the jury wants to hear, right?
Sure,
They
of
want to
course.
have it all make sense, but I think it's getting there. I think it's he's explaining the different things and how they all kind of link together. I think the story is building.
Yeah, and I like how he takes this and builds on top of the story as the second digital forensic expert in this trial.
Yep. No analogies from him yet. I mean, Jessica Hyde had that great analogy for the wall file with the in the restaurant. That was great. But sometimes you don't need an analogy.
Correct.
Or it doesn't come up.
Right, exactly. So join us every week on Thursday as we continue to dive into Karen Reed's first trial. Next week, we will be wrapping up Ian Whiffin's testimony. If you've enjoyed this episode, we just ask you a favor. Can you just leave us a review wherever you listen? It helps new listeners find us. So until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and always keep parsing the truth one bite at a time.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us to get notified the next time a new episode drops. If you can do more, head on over to parsingthetruth.com and donate by clicking on the donate button. Parsing the Truth is a nonprofit organization, and we are raising money to send a new digital forensic examiner to IASIS training next year in Orlando. Thanks.